Well, welcome everybody to the Parental Alienation Awareness Day conference brought to you by Parents Beyond Breakup. We've been running since Father's Day 1999, keeping mums and dads alive and in their kids' lives. Parental alienation can be an emotive topic, and you may hear differing views or experiences today. If you have any strong emotions coming up or want any further one-on-one support, please call us on our helpline. It's open 7 days a week. If you're within Australia, the number is 1300 853 437. We've brought together an expert panel of lived experience and professionals to open up a national debate about parental alienation, to move from just awareness and research to research, policy and action. Our panel consists of Pete Nicholls, our CEO of Parents Beyond Breakup, speaking from a parent's perspective. We also have Dr. Stan Carosi speaking from a policy perspective, Dr. Elise Price-Tobler speaking from an adult child survivor's perspective, and Adam Jones speaking from a family law perspective. And our first panelist is Pete Nicholls, who happens to be the CEO of Parents Beyond Breakup. But also, Pete, you are an alienated parent. And just briefly, I'd like to go straight into the background of how you find yourself where you are today, if you could, please.
Thanks, JD. And okay, so yeah, look, it's good to meet you all. Yes, I'm an alienated dad. I'm now divorced. I have two daughters. One I did not see very much of for the best part of 11 years, but I eventually won full custodial transfer when she was age 15. The second is now 19. In fact, today is her birthday on Parental Alienation Awareness Day, and I've not seen her since she was 3. I'm fully alienated from her, and despite my desire for it to be otherwise, I'm unable to have any contact with her.
Pete, thank you for being so open, but do you mind sharing with us, why do you not have any contact with your second daughter, but you do your first?
Okay, that's complex, but let's try and keep it simple. I mean, the family breakup happened very fast. It was sudden. I didn't see it coming. Almost immediately after the separation, I was faced with allegations that meant I couldn't see either of my girls. The allegations were pretty extreme. I'm sure that many here will know what that feels like. And I couldn't see my kids. The allegations were investigated. I was cleared, but that doesn't end up being the end of the problem. I mean, thereafter, it became an ongoing series of allegations, one after another, each of which, as soon as you clear up, is followed by another and then another, until enough time passes that you establish a status quo in which I don't see the youngest one, and we were permanently separated. The oldest one fought back a little bit, so I did get to see her. I did keep fighting for the youngest, and it took it to a pretty extreme level that most people wouldn't, but ultimately it was unsuccessful. And eventually the court got to the point where it recognized that mum, at least in my case, I know it happens both ways, but in my case, mum was so determined to never let me see my daughter that I was faced with an impossible decision of, what do I do next?
I think the reason we've got you speaking first is that you have your own lived experience as a parent facing this. You mentioned the impossible decision, and we hear that quite regularly from a lot of the mums and dads that use our Dads in Distress and Mums in Distress service. I'm going to take the risk of asking, can you elaborate a bit more? Can you tell us what was that impossible position or decision that you were placed with?
Yeah, so, well, look, towards the end of the hearing set of hearings for the youngest daughter, the senior judge at the time that we got in front of stated that it was clear that in my case, mum was never going to let me see our daughter. And frustratingly, even though I'd proven my case, that was going to be what was going to happen. It was clear that she wasn't going to stick to any court order that the court made, and there was a history of that. And shockingly to me, maybe not so much now looking back, he proceeded to inform me quite politely and professionally that if mum was continuing to demonstrate, if I continued to demonstrate that mum was going to be the problem, yet she was equally determined to never let me see our kid, then he would actually consider putting our 5-year-old daughter into care, because it was clear that we could not co-parent and that the child was then at risk. Now, I felt I could co-parent, but mum wouldn't. So he asked me to think on that. I did not at the time, and cannot understand how they would have come to such a conclusion, but I've also come to see this in other cases. I mean, right here in this room, there is another parent that I happen to know that recently faced the same thing here in Australia. My story was 14 years ago in front of a British judge, but we've got an Australian parent in this room right now who faced that same decision. That was, they were informed that if they didn't back away, the child would be put into care rather than to continue with the case. And I'm learning that on occasion, the courts, or at least some judges and some barristers, will use this as an act of last resort, or at least the threat of it, if they don't actually go through with it, to get a parent to back away when they're faced with another parent who's determined to alienate the child. So the effect is no different to someone holding a gun to the head of your child and saying, you either back away or it's over. So I walked away. But, I've gone through this. I'd gone through too many hearings. I'd become financially depleted. I'd learned that no matter how hard I pushed, the system was incapable, at least in my case, of doing the right thing. So I accept now that the court believed it was doing the best thing in near impossible circumstances, but it's hard for any rational observer on the outside to reconcile this kind of threat as a response to an alienating parent.
That is very hard to hear, and we're already getting messages through on the chat as we're running this live, recognising others that have been in almost the same situation. So really, thank you for sharing that part of your story. But can we go a little bit deeper, Pete? Why do you think the court acted in that way? If we can look at this rationally, why did they act in that way, do you think?
I guess this is the interesting thing about then ending up working in the sector, because you see thousands of cases. So look, in retrospect, through the benefit of the work that we do now and seeing so many cases, I can see that sometimes courts believe that two parents who cannot agree on custodial care, in their view, must be forcibly separated, and the impact of the child losing a parent is just a price that the courts assume is paid in that circumstance. Looking back, I can see some logic to that, but it's based on the assumption that there is no other option and that this is best for the child. I think neither of those two assumptions are correct. A child should be able to have contact with both its parents if it's safe, and regardless of any views of one parent on the other, you shouldn't be disconnecting them. There are other options, including, as happened with my eldest daughter, which is the custodial transfer, or perhaps some form of forced therapeutic intervention. For me, sadly, too often, we still see the courts acting on this kind of flawed logic, and it leads to why I act today in the form of a change agent. I'm determined that we lay the path to a point where this does not and cannot happen to a child. I'm determined that what was done to my two daughters cannot be done to anyone else's children.
Thank you again for, often from pain comes purpose. I know yourself and the team are dedicated to supporting parents and making change, but speaking then to that change agent element, what do you believe we should actually be doing? What action should we be taking, Pete?
This is a really relevant point. The reason why we've actually got the theme of today is victim turned change agent. I mentioned taking my own case to an extreme level, but that was through a significant amount of public campaigning that I did at the time, and it didn't get me anywhere. And that's actually true for almost everyone I've ever seen do that kind of thing. Yet we see the same flawed strategy adopted by so many others coming after me and even before me, coming into this for the first time. Knowing this and understanding what it means leads you to realize that we need a different approach. And for those that care to look, you can see that in various forms, family law, its ethos and activities have been questioned by campaigners since the 1960s and 70s across the developed world. Australia is not unique in that respect. We've seen somewhere around 60 years of campaigning, and yet things move very slowly and often in the wrong direction. Not always, but often. If we look at parental alienation specifically, we've had a name for it since the very early 80s, but that's not when the phenomena started. It's been around for a lot longer. That's 40 years ago that we even gave it a name. So the challenge for us is that the traditional go-to of campaigning, of flag waving and large-scale public activities like petitions and calls for inquiry, which I've sat on and given evidence to, it's not working. It's not having any measurable impact. And quite honestly, if anyone disagrees with me, I'd be very happy to hear exactly what change it has brought about, particularly in real terms. So raising awareness amongst those suffering gives us a name for it. It might even educate a few members of the public, but it also keeps the fight right down there amongst those that suffer. I think we do need to start speaking to the people that formulate policy and practice in this sector. And if you're going to do that effectively, then you have to start to learn to speak their language and how they think and why they do what they do, understand their motives for change. Now, I think positively, we've reached a point where enough people who've suffered this have gone on to work in the sector pretty effectively. And that's the guest list that we have today. And I think we now have the right people in the sector, particularly here in Australia, to start getting smart around affecting change. So to my mind, it's not about waving a flag and raising awareness anymore. We've moved past the point where that's actually effective. I think we need to shift from just awareness and research to research, policy, and action. I think you touched upon that earlier, JD, which I thought was awesome. So yeah, I think the generation of change agent has to be that of those with lived experience who've gone on to develop sector expertise. People like Stan Elise with us today, helping to identify the dynamic and the appropriate interventions. And then those interventions can be evidence-based, clearly articulated, formulated into policy guidance, and ultimately real-world change. I mean, it really hit me in 2011 when back in the UK, I got to sit in front of a senior politician who asked me, okay, so you've argued your point to get to the table, so what should I be changing? And it quickly dawned on me that despite all of my protesting, I did not have a clear answer, at least not one that he could act on. I had demands, I didn't have solutions. And I think that's something that's quite important to understand. So it's easy to say 50-50 parenting or custodial transfer, but for those who work in the sector, they actually need to know why, how, what are the risks of doing this? How do I deploy such a policy? Who do I need to train? So it's not as easy as it sometimes looks on the outside for us as parents. And so it's incumbent upon those of us who've managed to become professional in this sector now, those of us working in the sector with lived experience, to get smart about how do we formulate clear insight and start to logically and comprehensively inform policymakers. And I think that's how real change occurs, not because we protest and not because we wave flags to raise awareness. It comes from those who can make changes being handed the right information in the right way to enable them to make the change. And I think that's where we've got to. I for one, and PBB certainly is now looking, how can we provide the leadership required to get to that point of clarity?
Pete, you raised so many great points there, and I know there has been a lot of awareness. There's been a lot of light being brought to this subject, but you mentioned leadership. Let's get right down to it. What does that leadership really look like on the ground?
Well, look, I'll be making an announcement at the end of this short webinar. This is only the start of something much bigger today, so this is not it. It's what follows. But I will say, I think it's a carefully mapped out journey, and that it starts by having the right conversations with the right people. So conversations between parents and professionals, with the world's leading experts from multiple associated fields and from across the country. I mean, we need to speak to parents, to psychologists, to law enforcement, judiciary, media, academia, social scientists, politicians, you name them, to anyone that understands best practice in other countries around this subject. I mean, I think we need to collate that information, to publish and promote it, and to start informing and driving governmental policy around it. So at the same time, I would say enough of the collusive negativity that comes from, promoting victimhood and flag waving, and actually migrate into the real practical on the ground support kind of perspective. So, look, I mean, PDB has been supporting parents practically for 25 years now. And I think it's time we shifted gears and started doing so specifically for parental alienation afflicted families. And maybe, well, I'll speak about that a little bit more later. I won't kind of preempt it. But look, I probably am talking too much. But what I will say is this, that we are about practical support and real world progress. I think that's where PBB is heading. And I hope that some of you with us here today will come on that journey with us. I think you'll find it's more productive than what we've probably been doing up until now.
We deliberately asked you to speak first because you have lived experience. There's a lot of people joining us right now. The comments are just going berserk with people relating to even what you've just shared.